Hey, Nicole, thanks for joining me on the Homestead here.
Yeah, it's great to be here. I'm excited.
Yeah, it's good to have you up here. And we've known each other for quite a long time.
Yeah.
And we've both been food producers in more ways than one, really.
Yeah.
Why don't you give us a little background on who you are and what you do?
Yeah. So my name is Nicole Knegt, and I have been growing the majority of the fruits and vegetables that my family eats for the last 10 to 15 years. I started out small. I didn't start out growing everything all at once, but just with those, little benchmarks and eventually getting to a place where, we do grow the majority of the fruits and vegetables my family eats. And that really, the goal of that really came from having children. So my husband and I, we have 2 kids, and I just wanted my kids to eat good food. I wanted them to go into the garden and just pick beans and peas
Yeah.
and they're not picky eaters because they've just grown up with the privilege of growing up in a garden and eating whatever they wanted. So, and
Yeah.
I love that so much.
Yeah. And same for me, my kids as well. They come in here and they just eat whatever's there.
Yeah.
It's a really liberating thing.
Yeah.
But it's, I feel somewhat privileged in a way to be able to live this way because most people can't live this way. And right now, food prices are so insanely expensive. If
Yeah.
somebody wants to eat organic
Yeah.
and you want to feed your kids organic,
Yeah.
the costs are out of this world.
Yeah.
So talk a little bit about the financial aspect to food preservation and, how much can this really save somebody? It's one thing to grow your own food, but to preserve it allows you to do some things because you can buy in bulk and whatnot.
Yeah.
So talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so for us, we decided early on when we had kids that we would be a single income family. And in order to do that, especially in the city that we live, takes some significant sacrifices. And one of the sacrifices was, we don't have as much money to buy food. And that meant, we're eating lower quality food. And that was a sacrifice that we actually didn't really want to make. We wanted to feed our family organic food. And for us to do that, there was really only 2 options. One, I go out and get a big, high-paying job, and I'm not home with my children. Or I'm home with my children, and then the only option is that I need to grow the food. And so for us, that choice made the most sense because it enabled us for me to be home with the kids. It enabled us to actually pursue homeschooling because my daughter was dyslexic and regular school just didn't work for her. And so having the option of being home, but then subsidizing our income by growing the majority of the food we eat. Actually, I'm not necessarily going out to a job to bring in income, but I'm bringing income into our household because I'm reducing the requirement of income.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting when you think about it. So, for example, if I were to go out and work the big job, which for some people that's awesome and they love that, but for me, my value is to be home with my children. And so for me to have gone out to a big job, I would have then had to pay for childcare. I would have had to pay for specialized education for my daughter. I then would have lost a certain amount to income tax.
Absolutely.
And then taking that income, translating my time and energy into income that's taxed, and then I take that income and have to go to the grocery store and hope that my money is going to be able to buy the food that I want to eat.
Yeah.
For me, there's a lot of elements there that are really outside of my control. And whereas in contrast, when I just grow my carrots in the earth, now I have the privilege of having earth to grow carrots in, and for some people that's not available. But for me, we have a decent sized backyard and I can grow so much food in there. And I go and I pull a carrot out of the ground. It is not taxed and it is not, inflation doesn't touch it.
That's right.
And so for me, there's just tremendous freedom in that opportunity. And of course, not everyone has that opportunity, but we're going to talk about more options for people who don't have land of how they can harness the abundance of the earth in season. And I'm excited to talk about that as well. But for me, the finances, it just makes sense for us to grow our food, to preserve it, to have it through the wintertime. And and for us to be able to eat organically, it's really the only option because we just do not have the finances to be able to support that kind of lifestyle.
Well, and it's so interesting right now too because as you articulated right there is when you harvest something out of the ground, there's nothing in between you and that.
Exactly.
The system has really done a number on women in a ways with mothers to convince them that, hey, you're repressed at home. You're under the thumb of your husband, so go into the workforce and get repressed there, and then you're going to pay income tax, inflation, and all of these other things. It's just so funny how disabling that is and how enabling it is to go into the garden and get what you need for your family. And it is funny because we think about income, and what is that? That's just some kind of government term that's created, but it's there's so much more value that you actually create when you go and do these things yourself, because you're impervious to what goes on around the world.
Yeah, exactly. Right? And at the end of the day, like, we all need to eat. Like, this is something that we have to have. And every single day, all of us are making decisions around that. Like, we make decisions every single day, multiple times in the day, what we put into our bodies. Mm-hmm. And so the opportunity of taking my time and energy and translating that into food that I know is good, right? Because the other thing is, like, organic labels, there is unfortunately a dubiousness around that, of we don't know exactly if that was grown perfectly organically. Whereas for me, like, I can guarantee that I can translate my time and energy into food that is going to be good and is going to feed my family well. And at the end of the day, income is just translating time and energy. So
that's right.
How do we, and we need food. So what are the best decisions that we can make around feeding ourselves and translating time and energy into that necessity? Yeah.
So, we started with talking a little bit about the financial stability there. What do you think it looks like in terms of preservation? So, we kind of talked about here about saving money and time by growing your own food, not having to go to work to buy food at inflated costs and then bring that home, and not even really knowing where it's going. But as far as preservation, how do you think that is affecting you guys financially, opposed to buying food that's preserved? To preserve the food yourself, how do you think that affects you financially?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's really interesting because, especially this past year where we've seen significant rises in food costs, our kind of budget, my goal for each month is to only spend between $300 and $400 on food. And that includes my bulk purchase of food in the fall. Okay, right. So we bulk purchase meat in the fall, and then I do bulk purchase like flour and grains and different things like that, and spices. And so for me, like this past year, going to the grocery store, I'm going maybe once, twice a month, and I'm coming home with one small basket of food, because everything else is at home. And most of that food, honestly, is like treat food that we don't actually need, like chips and just kind of like the junk that we could actually totally survive without. And so for us, and granted, like, I do work, for the fall months, I'm working full time, if not over full time, to be able to put all of that food away. But the contrast of how just that price point is quite incredible, because and especially comparing the quality of food, right? So I'm putting away organic food. If you were to replace that food with store-bought, it's going to be upwards to $2,000. That's at least in Canada. Our prices are higher than the States, but so to replace that equitably, it would be significantly more. And so when you look at it from that perspective, and then also enabling me to be home, right?
What a privilege.
It's a huge privilege. So I think that for me, the finances really work out well.
They do, because in a way it all stacks in. It brings it all to home, no pun intended, but it really does. Then that if you can have a single income family like you guys do, same with us, there's so many wins that also come out of that. You're really stacking functions in a way. Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about food security, because we've built this great course on food security. What does that term actually mean to you?
Well, I think at the end of the day, food security is about having access to food. So you know, for me, I grow a significant amount of food, but I don't grow my meat, right?
Yeah.
So we don't have
Yep.
meat security.
Yep.
I have like fruit and vegetable security, but I don't have grain, I don't have meat, I don't have oil, kind of
Yeah.
those like keys or salt. Those are kind of
Yep.
like the staffs of life, right?
Yep.
And
Yep.
so for one thing, my meat, I have relationships with farmers, right?
Yep.
So I have a poultry farmer that I just bought like 20 chickens from this week. And for me, that's really important because she's working at 50% capacity this year due to a number of different reasons. And she's not taking on any new clients or any new people.
Yeah.
But I'm on her list. You know, I'm part
It's
of
good to
her
have those
clientele base,
connections.
right?
Yep.
And so... But for me, a big aspect of food security really comes down to my cold storage systems.
Yes.
So, you know, you can't live off of kale.
Yep.
You really need those carbohydrates. You need your potatoes,
Yep.
your squashes, your onions, your garlic, you know, your root vegetables. And those are ultimately stored in a cold storage system of some kind. And so when it comes to food security, it hinges on your cold storage systems. But we've seen in the last 70 years or so that our homes no longer include that.
No.
Right? So before the 60s, a home was built with a root cellar or
Yep.
with some kind of cold storage system because we didn't have refrigeration.
Yep.
And now we've really shifted to total dependence on refrigeration and total dependence on food storage, not only, it's outsourced, right? So we're outsourcing our food production, and preservation, but we're also outsourcing our food storage.
Yeah.
And that just there's a fragility to that.
Big time.
Whereas so for us, like we don't have, as a society, we don't have the capacity, the storage capacity to actually store a year's worth of food with our buildings as they are. And
Yeah.
so that's why a big aspect of the course is we do a deep dive on food storage systems, these cold storage systems, and really looking at like the least expensive, the easiest to implement systems that will get you just ahead of the game. Because it's easy. If you have a good cold storage system, you can store so much food, like it's
Yeah.
crazy.
It is. Yeah.
It's crazy.
Yeah.
And it's easy food like squashes and potatoes and things that maybe you don't grow, but you can go and get that in the fall time.
Yep.
You can go directly to a farmer and you can bulk purchase these foods, and as long as they're cured properly, which is something that we talk about in the course extensively, you can store a significant amount of food and really gain at least even like a quarter or half of your overarching food security just with a cold room.
Yep.
And
Yep.
so I think it's a huge, it's really a downfall that our buildings don't incorporate these free systems, right? Because you're just utilizing the coolness of the earth
Yeah.
or wintertime temperatures in our cold climates, and you're getting free refrigeration all winter.
Yeah.
And it's just unfortunate that we've lost that art.
Yeah,
our
well,
system.
like many things, you know, society has basically been dumbing down for the last 100 years.
Yeah.
And so, but I just want to touch on one bit of that because
Yeah.
I came to your guys' homestead when we reconnected after we'd been friends 10 years ago or more, hung out at the farmer's market a lot. Then when we reconnected, I got a little tour of your guys' homestead. You guys built a pretty sweet cold room
Yeah.
in your house, which didn't have anything like that at all. Talk a little bit about that system that you put together.
Yeah. I really love our indoor cold storage room because it was the simplest setup. We just used a storage hallway that had 2 walls that were exterior walls. Then one wall was to the garage. And then all we did was hang up bubble insulation. You
Yeah,
saw
right.
it.
Yeah,
It was
yeah,
kind
yeah.
of janky looking.
Yeah, but it works, right?
It worked like a charm.
Yep.
And so it was so simple. We created an insulated space that then we could maintain the temperature in there with a venting system. So we had a vent near the floor and a vent near the ceiling that brought exterior air, throughout the winter.
Yep.
Now this cold room only really works for about 6 to 7 months out of the year, but that's all you really need because it's
So it doesn't work in the summer.
doesn't work in the summer.
Okay.
No, but it works in the wintertime, and that's when you have like your massive harvest, right? So the majority of
Yes,
the food
exactly.
that you are going to be storing is in September, October. And so we just filled that space up to the rafters with food, and then it kept beautifully all the way until like end of April.
Yep.
And then at that point you have much less food, and then we are able to transition that to a refrigerator.
Right.
Right? So I'm
Yeah.
still using a refrigerator, but for small amounts. And the bulk of my food is not dependent upon electricity. It's dependent simply on a like super simple,
Low tech.
low
Yep.
tech
Yep.
system of vents. And that's it.
That's
and
yeah,
insulation.
absolutely, and that is so much more resilient
Yeah.
going forward in whatever's going to happen in the kind of situation we're in right now. So one of the things that you hear out there, and we hear a lot of stuff these days, it's often fear-based, it's a bunch of propaganda for the most part, but people do bring up, in the case of food preservation, this fear of things like botulism
Absolutely.
or messing it up. What do you say to that?
Yeah. So botulism it's real, and it is a serious concern when it comes to canning low acid foods. And some people, the issue is that it's definitely been kind of blown out of proportion, the fear, but it is serious. So botulism is a bacteria that's like naturally in the soil and water. The bacteria itself will not harm you at all. So you can consume it and nothing bad will happen. But when that bacteria is placed in a certain environment, so it needs to be anaerobic environment, so no air, so in like a nice little jar,
Yep.
and it needs liquid, and it needs to be at a certain, basically room temperature.
Yep.
And then that bacteria will it's a spore-forming bacteria, and that spore will then create a neurotoxin. And the neurotoxin at fairly low levels can cause human illness, and in higher levels can cause death. And
Yeah.
so that's where people, have a high level of concern, which is reasonable, about, canning. But what is never talked about, and this is what is interesting, is the fact that if you simply take that food, say for example, you have canned tomato sauce, and the tomatoes, are maybe a bit more low acidic. They've got onions and peppers and garlic, foods that could potentially harbor botulism. If you simply warm that spaghetti sauce up, which you normally would
Anyways, yeah. Yeah.
you heat it. It doesn't even need to boil. So 85 degrees Celsius, so just below boiling, for a minimum of 5 minutes, and it will kill the neurotoxin. So the toxin itself is very susceptible to heat. And so if you simply boil the food for 5 minutes, you're
Right.
absolutely guaranteed to have killed any botulism that would exist in that food.
Which is pretty much how everybody cans anyways.
Exactly.
Right?
And so the instances of botulism actually are only from people generally eating canned fish. So when you look at the data, so I sat down and I really researched this because I wanted to give people the most accurate information about botulism,
Yeah.
because people are terrified of it,
Yeah.
which is reasonable. But the reality is that it's very rare. And when it does happen, it's usually from canned fish.
Right.
Because you eat it cold, you're not
Right,
heating
right,
it
right.
up. And so when it comes to botulism, it's just a matter of educating ourselves, understanding the mechanism behind it, and understanding how we combat it. So preservation at the end of the day is that you are preserving your food from 3 things: decay, that it can be bacterial decay, yeast, or fungal decay. So you've got molds, yeast, and then the botulism bacteria. And so when we understand the preservation methods and how they work, you're going to feel so much more confident in the food that you've preserved, that you know that you're not going to hurt your family. So for example, my one friend, she canned peaches, and she wouldn't eat them, and she wouldn't let anyone eat them because she was terrified that she was going to make somebody sick.
Oh.
And so, but it comes from it's good to not want to hurt people, obviously, but it comes from unfortunately an ignorance
Yeah.
that anything could harbor botulism, and that's not true. So when it comes to canning, and this is in the course, we go through all these preservation methods, and we look at all the different the methodology behind it, so we understand what it is that we're preventing. So when it comes to botulism, you can prevent it with acidity. So like all fruits are acidic enough to prevent botulism. So you will never have botulism in a can of peaches.
So
ever,
there you have it.
Right?
Right.
Or applesauce. And you don't have to be adding any lemon juice or sugar. Like, you don't have to add anything. The fruit in and of itself is totally acidic enough to
Right.
prevent the growth of botulism. And so then other things like pickles, if you add vinegar, any kind of high acidity, no botulism.
Then it's over.
Right? It's
Wow.
over. And then if you have like zero liquid, So that's where dehydration is awesome. You're not going to get any yeast, fungi, or botulism on dehydrated foods. And so as you go through the list, and there's an extensive list of all these different methods that we can utilize for preservation, and just understanding, okay, what is it that we're preserving the food against, understanding the mechanism, and then feeling totally confident in being able to eat that food and feed it to other people. But I love the fact that the botulism toxin is so not heat tolerant. Like it poops out with any kind of heat. And that is such a comfort, because I love to can tomatoes, but in the recipes, you have to add a significant amount of lemon juice or citric acid to it to prevent botulism. But I don't like the taste of it. It sucks.
Right.
It's too acidic.
Right.
And so realizing that, well, I can can my tomatoes without the acidity added, and as long as I heat the tomatoes up, I'm not going to kill anybody.
Right.
It's going to be perfectly safe.
This is the food service industry that is overly pushing these health protocols that are most often unnecessary. So you did mention a little bit about the different methods of food preservation. Yeah. What are your primary methods that you use on the homestead?
Okay. Well, what's really interesting is when people think about food preservation, they automatically think about canning. That is like their number one. They just oh, I'm going to can everything. Yeah. And I've totally had that attitude where I've had years where I have just literally canned absolutely everything. Yeah. And the reality is that canning is actually the most labor intensive and the most difficult form of preservation that preserves the least amount of food. Right. Okay? It really is like at the bottom of my list. Okay. And which is interesting because most people, they go straight to canning, they lose their marbles over it because it's so labor intensive and you're like slaving over a boiling hot pot and you're scalding yourself and it's really hard. And then you've got like these 7 jars. Yeah, right. You're like, oh, all that was an entire afternoon for these 7 jars. And usually what happens is people get super discouraged. Yeah. And they then stop. And they're like, well, that's a waste of my time. It's too much work, blah, 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 blah. Right, right. And so, but what I've discovered is that there are so many more preservation techniques that are way less labor intensive. And going back to the cold storage systems, honestly, your best place to start is the cold storage, because you can put your potatoes and all your squashes and all these like high value, high carbohydrate crops into that space. And then we do in-ground cold store, like for our root vegetables, we store them in the ground. In the ground, yeah. And so there's overwintered carrots and beets and things like this. Some parsnips. And that's incredible because we can have like hundreds of pounds of food in the garden, and I've literally done nothing. I've just grown them, mulched them, put a tarp over them, and because of our temperature, and they've, like this last winter, they survived 3 weeks of minus 25 degrees Celsius. Wow. Right? And that's like 7 degrees Fahrenheit. So quite cold, and for a good length of time, and they were perfectly fine. And I left those carrots in the ground until the end of April. Wow. And they were fine. Yeah. And they were amazing and crunchy and beautiful.
And with our really cold spring, that worked. Because normally that wouldn't work. No. You couldn't do it that far. Yeah, they'd start to be going to seed, right? Yeah. Yeah. And so just that in and of itself, you instantly have so much food. Yeah. Without even having to like barely do anything. Right. Right? You're just putting food into the cold storage. And then my second is I do like freezing. It is an easy, straightforward method as long as you have a backup system to support your freezer in case there is any kind of electrical issues. Mm-hmm. And so I always have that caveat of I love my freezer, but I don't want to store everything in the freezer. I do like to have like multiple ways of preserving. Yeah. And then my next favorite is dehydration. Uh-huh. Dehydration is awesome because it's half the work for canning. So say, for example, if I'm dehydrating tomatoes, same process for canning. I'm, blanching, pulling the skins off. I'm chopping them up. But then from there, I just have to lay them on trays. And then that's it. And that's it. And then dehydrate them. Yeah. Whereas with canning, I'm chopping, I'm then heating, I'm then like doing all the jars and filling and like on and on and on and on. Mm-hmm. And I can only, can 7 jars at a time in my water bath canner. And so the length of time and the amount of food that I can preserve is like, it's limited by that process. Whereas the dehydration method, and then you have like
so many tomatoes in like a little tiny jar.
Yeah.
And they make the most amazing sauce, like incredible sauce. It's
Yeah.
just amazing. So for me, a lot of my sauces, I dehydrate most of my like, you know, I've got eggplant. Eggplant is amazing dehydrated. Peppers, zucchini, the tomatoes, garlic. I even dehydrate. I had a ton of garlic this year that we just had way too much. We grew like 15 pounds
Wow.
of garlic.
Wow.
And so I dehydrated like, I don't know, a lot of garlic. And so now I have like amazing dehydrated garlic for all my sauces. So for me, you know, kind of starting with the cold storage and then working down with like, so a lot of my meat is in the freezer. One of my goals, like my next kind of milestone, is to start to learn how to preserve meat so that it doesn't require to be in a freezer.
Right.
With salting and drying and that kind of thing. And then from there, it's dehydration. And then I really love under oil preservation. And
Okay.
under oil preservation is awesome because all you're doing is blanching your so like peppers, I blanch the peppers in vinegar. You dry them completely, not dehydrate them, but so that they're completely dry.
As in there's no standing water in
No
them?
water on them.
Right, okay.
Yeah, whatsoever.
Yeah.
Which then negates any opportunity of botulism to be on. So the outside of the vegetable is completely dry. There's no botulism.
Right.
And then you pack it in oil. And that's it.
Easy.
And then these peppers taste as like, yeah, they're gently cooked, but
Yeah.
they still have a firm, amazing texture.
Bit of crunchiness to them still?
Yeah, all the way. We're still eating it's June. I still have like my last jar in the fridge.
Wow.
And then I store those in the cold storage over wintertime, and they're amazing. Like
Wow.
it's just incredible. And then you've got fermentation, and then at the bottom of the list is my my canning. And canning I save for those foods that make other food taste better. So like the sauces,
Right.
things like that, relishes, that kind of stuff.
Pickles. And,
And pickles.
Yeah.
And then I do like to can peaches. That's like my one treat, is
Right.
that I will make the effort to can 1 million jars of peaches because who doesn't love cracking open a jar of sunshine in the middle of winter,
absolutely.
right?
Yeah.
So for me, that's my process. And it's really kind of like inverted from what most people think. They think, oh, I'm going to can first.
Yeah.
But it's no, don't can.
Yeah.
Just set up a cold storage system. Go dig a trench in your backyard and like put Tupperwares and put a bale of hay on top of it. And you will be able to store so much food just using the earth's just constant temperature, right?
Well, I like this idea in that it's following sort of the path of least resistance. Where's the low-hanging fruit first? What's
Totally.
the easiest stuff I can do? And then
Yeah.
save the hardest stuff and do less of that because in a way, too, you're also hitting another... you're doing something else in that you're diversifying all these processes as well, which is super important.
Yeah.
As you said, too, if you just freeze everything, well, what if your freezer goes down?
Yeah.
And so a diversity of approaches covers you. It creates a sort of resilience, right?
Totally. And that's where food security really comes down to resiliency. And with food, for us, we grow a lot of our food, but if you aren't able to, you can still have resiliency. You just need to go find people who grow food.
Yeah.
And you need to build relationships
Yes.
with those
Yeah.
people. And so, for example, I don't grow apples, but we have friends who grow apples.
Yep.
So what I did is this last year, I said, okay, I'm going to give me a whole bunch of apples. And so they gave me like 120 pounds of apples. And what I did is I processed them all. I'd made them into apple chips and applesauce. And then I gave half of those apples back to my orchardist friend in the form of apple chips and applesauce.
Oh, wow.
And they were so pumped.
As payment.
As payment.
Perfect.
Right? And
Yep.
so it's like I'm just translating my energy into food that then I don't have to actually exchange currency for.
Yep. Perfect.
Which I love. But again, back to like the freezer situation, I want to be able to say store certain items in there, but be able to store it in such a way that if the freezer goes down, like we do have a generator, but again, I don't know how long that, like there's so many variables,
There's so many
right?
variables, yeah.
And being able to be like, okay, I feel confident that I could manage dealing with the food in the freezer if I had to,
Yeah.
right? So, and having all those strategies for like managing that food, like I've dehydrated frozen food and I've canned frozen food. Like you can do it. It's not that, it has a bit of a different texture, but there's all these strategies for being able to manage freezer failure. And that's really important to have
Wow.
like in your back pocket, right?
Wow. So we've built this course together called Food Security 101. And there's a lot in this, but one thing I really like is how you have really focused on what works.
Yeah.
So why don't you talk a little bit about what we've done with this course and what's in there and what people can learn, because we've just really scratched the surface here.
Yeah. So the course starts out with looking at cold storage systems, and just like beating a dead horse here, your cold storage systems are like they are the linchpin to food security. So we look at 5 different systems that are low cost, easy to implement, and just like knock it out of the park winners. And so we look at that, and then I shift to 7 forms of preservation, which I've kind of briefly talked about here. But we go into quite a bit of detail. So we do a deep dive into, looking at botulism and getting all of that information really squared out. And then we look at each preservation method. So we're doing water bath canning, we do pressure canning, and then we also do something called dry canning, which is canning dry goods. So removing the oxygen out of jars so that you can preserve beans and grains and things like that. And then we do freezing, fermentation, under oil preservation, and did I say fermentation? Anyways,
and
yeah.
fermentation.
So we look at a bunch of these preservation methods, and then I look at the top 10 fruit and vegetable families. And so what we're doing with that is I'm applying the cold storage systems and the preservation methods to the top 10 fruit and vegetable families. So like brassicas, the nightshade family, all these, then you can extrapolate to all of your other fruits and vegetables, because I can't obviously go through every single fruit and vegetable that exists. And what I'm doing in this, the idea is to apply the 80-20 principle. So I'm trying to give you the most efficient and time-effective methods that are going to get you the farthest, the fastest, right? So it's that like 20% of input gets you 80% of the way there. And so that's because at the end of the day, food preservation and harvest, it's time consuming. Like,
big time.
That it can actually be, I think that it's actually the most difficult aspect of, for sure, of like homestead farming. When you come to, because it's all at once.
Yes, that's right.
And you need to have a system, you need to have the methods, and you need to have these techniques that are going to work. Like, it's horrible spending days working at something, and then it ends up producing a product that just totally sucks and your family doesn't want to eat.
And you spend all the time to grow it and do everything in between. So
this is where I've taken 15 years of real time, like trial and error, to be able to give you the most effective methods. Because at the end of the day, like, you could look up a bunch of stuff on YouTube, but you're going to just be bogged down. You're just going to get in the weeds with all this different stuff that at the end of the day, you don't even know if it really works. And this course, we actually filmed this course at the beginning of spring, so early spring, because I wanted to show everyone how the techniques worked. So I wanted to show everyone like what's in the cold storage and how well everything preserved. In my little root cellar, how well the apples preserved, and how crunchy they were still in like the beginning of April. And so for me, it's really just giving you guys the skills and showing that these techniques work and that they are reliable and you're going to have success.
And the big advantage of this, folks, is not so that we save you the time, because people might be thinking, well, we could just go and look all this up on YouTube, and you certainly can, but you're sifting through a sea of content. And I find that actually as a homesteader now, somebody who's been in the gardening and market gardening space for many years, is the problem we have now is there's too much stuff out there.
It's overwhelming.
And there's no filter with a lot of it. A lot of people just make videos and don't know what they're talking about. And it's one thing to do that with some things, because hey, that's okay. But when it comes to this kind of thing, it's so valuable and so important that you can mess it up, and then you just wasted all that time.
And
you
all that
and everything,
and all that food, right? Like,
all that food,
We don't want to waste food. We want to be able to harness that abundance in the fall and put it away and do it safely and do it correctly. Because the reality is, like, I've made a ton of mistakes. So even this last year, I didn't cure my squashes properly. I tried to cure them in a
I've
greenhouse,
done that many
and it
times.
was terrible.
Yeah,
And by January, 40 squashes were rotting.
Yeah.
And so, and then with that, I had to figure out different techniques. So like we dehydrated, we were freezing, we were doing all these things to like try to save them.
Yeah.
And that's where this course is going to give you the skills that you need to just like not make silly mistakes like that
Yeah.
and lose.
And just have
food.
success right
Yeah.
out of the gate. Yeah.